So once again, in keeping with my boxing theme, just get some water there. Been making quite a few videos today. Keeping with my boxing theme, I'm at a point now where, having had my first fight, which was a loss, I'm in a good position to reflect on whether or not I want to continue the sport. I do believe that it's going to be part of my life in some way in the future. How far I'll go, I don't really know. Certainly if I enter the ring again, I'll try to learn from my mistakes. I've looked at my fight footage a few times, at least the first 30 seconds of it, and I made some very, very foolish mistakes. So definitely I understand why I lost that. I made some very foolish mistakes. My punches were too far reaching, so the guy saw them coming. My legs were far apart. The gum shield wasn't in proper. There was a lot of very fundamental things that I got wrong. But it was only my first fight, so I'm not beating myself up too much about it. So yeah, it's a good time to reflect. So what I want to do is make 2 videos on the pros and cons of boxing generally. This is not about white collar boxing, this is about boxing generally. Making it partly on my own reflection, but also just for anyone who might maybe empathise with some of these views, or connect with some of the views. And again, I'll be bringing in some things that I brought, issues that I've raised in previous videos, but this is more a collective video of general pros and cons rather than specific things. What I mean is I'm sort of having a summary rather than focusing on specific things. So first of all, the first video is going to be the cons, the negative side. I'll get that out of the way. Get the glass half empty side out of the way first. Okay, for me, there are quite a few things I don't like about the sport, or I think that definitely cast a shadow over the sport. And by the way, these are things that go back long time, long before my own fight, and my own fight actually doesn't even come into it much, because these things weren't a factor in my fight, but they are a factor in wider boxing. Disrespect. This is something that unfortunately is too common in the sport. Whilst there's a lot of respect in the sport, there is also far too much disrespect. That could be disrespect between certain fighters. It could be, and it's particularly common among fans. I've made some rather vocal videos about what I think of, well, as far as I'm concerned, are trolls. That is the sort of people who come online and slander fighters in a way that goes beyond just having an opinion. Now what I mean by that is everyone can have an opinion on certain fighters and skill. This is a competitive sport, so some fighters are inevitably going to be better than others, and people can make arguments both ways. I've really no problem with that. But what I do have a problem with is people who come on and use language that really is just not appropriate at all, or at least not. I'll try and explain what I'm talking about. When you see so-called fans come on and call a certain fighter a card or a bum or a tomato can, there's a few things I want to say about that. As Oscar de la Hoya said, it doesn't matter if you are stepping into your first professional fight or you're a multiple world title holder. It takes guts to enter that ring. Now, I'm not bigging myself up here, but I know it does from experience. And what I done was, small fry to what some of these guys do. I mean, earlier I was watching a bit of a clip from the Carl Froch George Groves fight, second fight. To stand in front of 80,000 people and test yourself against another man in that way. And Groves had actually posted a quote from Theodore Roosevelt, very famous quote on it's easy for critics to tear down strong men. Well, to me that is what these cyber trolls are like. They're the guys, mostly guys, who hide behind screens and slander fighters, and you can guarantee that 99% of them have never been in a ring. And even if they have, it's still trashy, It's a trashy attitude, because if they have done that, they should have more empathy. Now this is different from disliking a certain fighter. There's fighters I don't particularly like. I don't like their personality. But you can still respect them as sportsmen, or at least as boxers, for what they do, for stepping between the ropes. And unfortunately, far too many, in my opinion, plastic fans forget that fact. Now, my own experience hasn't been a bad one. Everyone I know has been very respectful. I haven't had any personal slack, so this is not a personal thing. But I do see it a lot on videos for famous fighters, and those guys have tough skin. They probably don't care that much. But for me, it is about values. For me, it really degrades the sport, and I hate it. I absolutely hate that. I hate to see people come on videos and say such and such a fighter is like a girl, such and such a fighter is a card, such and such a fighter is a bum. It really makes me so angry. And it isn't just famous fighters. Saying that about any fighter is crude. Unless you have stepped between those ropes, then just shut the fuck up. That's really my attitude. And I take a very hardline view on this, because as far as I hate people who try to tear down others who are trying to do something with their life, trying to have achievements. In a boxing match, one guy wins, one guy loses. And this isn't a personal thing, because I was saying this before my fight. So it just, you know, it really takes a real low life to tear down fighters when they're not doing it themselves. I'm not saying you have to like fighters, and I'm not saying, you know, obviously people are going to support their man, but that doesn't mean that you have to disrespect the other guy. So my next point is that sometimes that then gets into nationalism, and you see, for example, certain fans disrespecting another national anthem and things like that. It is a problem among some British fans, but it's not unique to this country. You see it in other countries as well. And it's just very sad that these people are so pathetic that they can't express their support for their fighter without disrespecting the other fighter or his or her country. There's just no need for it. It is a competitive sport. It's good to have a robust, energetic environment. You know, it makes the environment, but I think you could be an enthusiastic, supportive fan without disrespecting the other fighter. Even when I see a lot of British fights, I hear the chant, "Easy, easy." And I really want to say to those people, you think it's easy, you get in the ring. I mean, people might say I'm too sensitive, but I'm someone that really believes in values, and it just really pisses me off that so many fans out there have such fundamental disrespect. There's just no need for it at all. What other things I dislike? Corruption. That is indisputable. It may be hard to control, and you could argue it exists in every sport, but it is obvious in boxing. It was probably worse in the 60s when you had the mafia controlling and totally fixing fights. It probably was worse then, so I guess in that sense it's not as bad. But there are certain situations when there's clearly biased decisions, whether it be because a fight is taking place in a certain country, or maybe the judges were from the same country. I don't think it's very common, but it does unfortunately exist. Likewise, I don't like when you get, for example, you get a fighter who's clearly fighting dirty, for example, giving rabbit shots and things like that, and the referee, not necessarily the referee, but the judges do nothing. Now, to me, call me old-fashioned, but I believe in playing by the rules in any sport. And if a fighter is blatantly fighting dirty, he or she should be getting points taken off them. And far too often, it's just ignored, like it's not a big deal. But for one thing, rabbit shots are dangerous. They are banned for a reason. If you're hit in the back of the head, it can hit the nerve leading to the spine. So there's a reason they're banned. And I think fighters who do that really should be, and even fighters that I like have been guilty of doing this. So really, the book should be thrown at them. There's no excuses for knowingly breaking rules in a sporting event. These people are professionals. They're meant to set an example. I know people will say I'm boring or something, but that's the way I feel about it. Yeah. And unfortunately, a lot of fighters are guilty of that. I think it discredits the sport. It only lends to critics who say it's brutal. Okay, what else do I dislike? Well, there's no escaping the fact there are health factors involved in this sport, and in the end of the day, you cannot argue that being hit repeatedly on the head is healthy. It's not. I had a lengthy sort of reply to one of my subscribers who was very critical when I made the white collar video, and I stand by everything I said, but at the same time I do respect those who believe it's a brutal sport, because there is a brutal side to boxing that simply cannot be ignored, and those of us who follow the sport and are involved in the sport can't really dispute that. I remember Nicola Adams, London medalist, tried to say that boxing's feminine, there's feminine aspects to it, and I don't know if she was just trying to do her part for feminism or something, but to me that is utterly ridiculous. Boxing is not feminine, it's not elegant, it is a brutal sport, and you can't escape that fact whatsoever. And I admit there's times when, you know, when you see a guy getting really badly beaten up, it's not an even match, it can be hard to watch, and sometimes referees are too slow in stepping in there. They get slack sometimes for stepping in, but their job is critical, and a good referee will make good judgment. Now I've know, in terms of my fight, the referee made the right call. I wasn't defending myself, I could have been seriously injured. He made the right call, so I'm not complaining about that. But basically, yeah, there are health risks in this. Men have died in the ring and been seriously injured. I don't like it, it makes me uneasy. That doesn't mean that happens in the majority of fights. It doesn't happen, and that would be the caveat to that, but those of us involved in boxing can't deny that it is a problem, and it's very, very hard to justify that. What else do I not like? Well, I guess this comes back to respect, but too many fans don't take on board what boxers actually go through in terms of training. I mean, they see a 50-minute fight, sometimes this. They don't see what actually happens in terms of training. So in some ways that is not really respected. Trying to think of some other things that I don't like in the sport. Sometimes fighters aren't acknowledged for the skills that they have, and because of what I would call boxing politics, they don't get recognition they deserve. Boxing, like a lot of sports, is a lot about business, so there is a lot of it that is frankly unfair. I mean, as an example of that, if you have someone fighting a world champion, the world champion's always going to get more money, because he's going to bring more revenue to the event. Now the challengers don't necessarily have a problem with that, but again it comes down to those who say that boxing isn't a fair sport. They would point to things like that, and I think it can be a problem. Trash talking, and this is from fighters. Too many fighters bring this in, and I understand it helps to hype up a fight, and I can accept it to a certain extent, but you get the likes of Shannon Briggs that go way over the top, and then they just bring the sport into disrepute. So I really don't like that. And then sometimes it gets really personal, and you get fighters who just should be ashamed of themselves of some of the sort of language that they're using. Sort of racking my mind here for things I don't like, because there's definitely a lot of things I don't like in the sport. When you get a biased crowd, it's not fun to watch. I prefer fights where you have a neutral crowd, because it isn't much fun seeing a guy. I mean, boxers are trained to phase that out, but you know, you'd have to be a robot not to be impacted. If you're listening to 20,000 people booing you, you have to be a robot not to be impacted by that. And I have to admit, I find fights like that harder to watch than fights that have a neutral crowd. So that's just some thoughts off the top of my head about what I don't like in the sport. So next video is going to be the positive aspects of the sport.